We welcome you all here. We want to thank you for coming to our Challenge Success first forum for the year about sleep. I'm going to pass it over to Mr. Eldred to do a little talk, and then he'll come back to me. Thanks.
Good evening, everyone. I want to thank Challenge Success and our PTSA and Heather, especially for coming to talk to us and our parents today about the importance of sleep. This is going to be one of many forums that Challenge Success is going to be doing this year for our parents about how we can really help the social and emotional and health and well-being of our students, which is so critically important. I just want to read a quote real quick, which I feel sort of speaks to why we are here tonight. It says, "If you're not getting enough sleep, any human being is challenged. When you get the teenage brain involved in that equation, you're talking about somebody being really, really challenged to feel contented and peaceful and happy with the world around them." I think this is so true. Sleep is so critical, and it seems to be one of these things that has fallen by the wayside for all of us, but most especially our students. So I really want to thank Heather for coming out tonight and educating us about the importance of sleep for our students.
Great. Thank you so much, John. So I'm just going to put a quick little, share my screen really quickly. Okay, so I know we have a lot of freshman parents here, and you might not know much about Challenge Success. So I don't want to spend too much time talking about this, but I want you to understand why we're here tonight. So Challenge Success is a group at Stanford University. It evolved from the Stressed Out Students Project. It works with schools and families to develop research-based strategies that provide students with the academic, social, and emotional skills needed to succeed now and in the future. SPHS partnered with Challenge Success back in 2016. So they've done a lot with Challenge Success, but we're working to do even more in the next coming years. So our mission statement is, we chose to partner with Challenge Success to examine what a healthy and balanced high school experience looks like and how the perceived stressful race to college and beyond is increasing anxiety and stress in our children. So we're committed to partner with our families so that together we will raise students to be independent, adaptable, ethical, and engaged, as well as being healthy, motivated, and happy. So in the spring, we did a survey for all of the school. About 1,173 students participated, which was 81% of the school. It was a survey created by Challenge Success to really gauge how the kids were doing at school. Of that, we had a lot of goals that came out of that. You can look on our website, which I will put up in just a little bit, to see what those goals all are that we're really working towards this year, but sleep was a big one. What we found was students are reporting of getting an average of 6.9 hours of sleep per weeknight. The recommended is like 8 or 9, really 9. And the 86% of students keep phones in the room. So Heather will talk to this, but you can see on that graph there where the sleep hours were. We did find that as you got older, sleep got worse. So 9th graders weren't so bad, but seniors were pretty awful about getting sleep. So that's where we came up with our survey goals of sleep. We're going to work with parents and students to educate them on the importance of sleep. So we're doing this tonight for you. And then even though Heather's on Zoom for us tonight from her home, she's coming all the way over to our school tomorrow, braving the traffic in the morning. And we're having 2 assemblies for all of the students at school. So they won't see the same thing you're seeing tonight, but they will see a shortened version of it tomorrow. And we will introduce students also to what Challenge Success is, and have the wellness officers there as well. So I would like to welcome Heather Turgeon. Heather is a psychotherapist, sleep specialist, and co-author of 3 books, including The Happy Sleeper and her new book, Generation Sleepless. Her writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Atlantic, and the Washington Post, and she's been a guest on several NPR shows. Heather and her partner, Julie, help families with babies and kids of all ages sleep well, and she has an elementary schooler and a high schooler. So now I'm going to stop sharing, and Heather's going to share, and we're going to get on.
All right. Thank you. All right. So I am going to share my screen. Okay, so thank you so much. I'm really happy to be with you. As you mentioned, I'm a psychotherapist and a sleep specialist. My partner and I have been working with families on sleep for many years. We wrote a book called The Happy Sleeper many years ago, which is really geared to babies and little kids. And so we've been working with families as our practice expanded, and we started working with older and older kids and basically helping the whole family sleep. What we really realized was that teenagers are the ones who need our help the most. They are by far the most sleep deprived age group, and even for their age group, they are the most sleep deprived that they've ever been. So at this moment in time, today's adolescents are the most sleep deprived group ever in human history. And when we saw this happening in our practice, but we also looked at the data and immediately saw that confirmed in every research study of sleep. It is amazing to see this trend in a drop off in sleep in teenagehood. So we were inspired, basically, when we put this all together, we set out to write Generation Sleepless to figure out why exactly that is. We had some ideas, but we didn't quite know. And we really wanted to explore the complex reasons that that's happening at this moment in time, and then I'll offer solutions to improve it so that our kids can get more sleep. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So I'm just going to start off by giving you a sense of what I mean by this drop off in sleep. We hear a lot about sleep in the media, I think, and we hear mostly about adult sleep and adult sleep deprivation. And the truth is that adults are actually doing pretty well compared to teenagers. So this is the amount of, this is how elementary schoolers are sleeping. About 70% of elementary schoolers get healthy sleep during the school week. About 60% of adults are getting healthy sleep on a regular basis. But as Kristen alluded to, by 12th grade, only about 5% of adolescents are getting optimal sleep on a school night. And so this is it's a nosedive basically that starts happening in middle school. And it really picks up speed and reaches its most acute level by 12th grade. And so it's astounding how that has happened. If you look at data from the 1990s, you'll see that already teenagers were really the most sleep deprived of all of us. But since then, it has been getting worse and worse. The smartphone made it worse. COVID actually made it worse. And now this is what we're looking at, is that only 5% of kids in 12th grade are getting optimal sleep. And I'll talk about what that means in just a minute. So here's a question for you. I want to make sure everybody can see this though. I think that's okay. All right, question for you is, do high schoolers need as much sleep as fifth graders? And mostly I'm assuming that you're all gonna be like, no, that's not the case, because as kids get older, their need for sleep goes down, right? But actually the answer is yes, they do. From the age of about 11, somewhere between 10 and 12, so let's say an average of 11, from the age of about 11 until 18, sleep needs do not go down. And this is a huge misconception that we have. The need for sleep for a teenager is extraordinarily high. Why is that? Really, I mean, it makes perfect sense. So much is going on in their brains. They are entering the term adolescence really refers to around age 12 to 25. It's this whole period of brain development that kids are going through. It's when a lot of remodeling in the brain is happening. So, we know, I think that because teenagers can look like mini adults, sometimes they seem like they're almost, like they're basically adults, right? They just have a little more growing to do. Not true at all. When they enter into adolescence, they're beginning a new chapter of brain development. So their prefrontal cortex is becoming much more wired and more refined and more integrated with the rest of the brain. That's important because that's where we get our judgment, our wisdom, our emotional regulation, our ability to reflect on our thoughts, to have emotional intelligence, really important stuff. So, and that a lot of that, so this high need for this high developmental, surge comes with a high need for sleep. It's just the same as, when you had a toddler and you're like, of course they need to take a nap. Of course they need to have 11 hours of sleep. Their brains are growing so much. They're growing and changing so much. No one would deny the amount of sleep that a toddler needs because of how much development they're going through. But what we now know is that the second decade of life is just as important in terms of brain development as the first decade is. And it's amazing to see how much of that refining and pruning actually happens while teenagers are sleeping. So it's quite, and just because they need as much sleep. So when researchers basically give, teenagers, this happened a couple decades ago at Stanford, they brought a group of 10-year-olds to the sleep lab at Stanford. They measured their sleep. They had them sleep as much. They dedicated, a certain amount of time to sleep. They could sleep as much as they wanted. And they brought them back every summer until they were 18. And what they were doing was trying to figure out, okay, when does their need for sleep decline and how much does it decline? And what they were astounded to find out is that it does not decline. So a 10-year-old will sleep about 9 and a quarter hours. And an 18-year-old, if you give them the opportunity, will sleep 9 and a quarter hours. So that is really related to the brain development that they're going through. So here's how much sleep we all need at different ages. Adolescents, so something that's important to know is that 9 and a quarter hours is what the ideal amount of time, we call it optimal sleep. This is the optimal amount of sleep that the teenage brain and body would like to have. It's really far off from what all of them are getting. But the fact remains that that is the optimal amount of sleep that their brains and bodies would like to have. 8 hours of sleep is what we consider adequate sleep. And that's really because when they get below 8 hours on a regular basis, this is where you see a correlation with a lot of negative effects. So things I'm going to talk about, the consequences of sleep loss, and really a lot of these things, 8 hours tends to be a tipping point. So that tends to be where we see that there are a lot more negative effects of sleep deprivation under 8 hours. So have that in mind. I like to tell freshmen in high school, I like to tell middle schoolers and freshmen in high school to try and get 9 hours of sleep. It can be an aspirational goal, but it's actually quite doable for some freshmen. Once they get to be sophomores, and then if they're taking APs and they're on a sports team and they live far away from school, it can get harder and harder. And for them, I try to help them get 8 hours of sleep. So that's just good to know. So if you think about how they need about 9 hours of sleep optimally, and the average high schooler is getting around 6.5, we're missing around 2 hours of sleep every night of the school week. So by the end of the week, come Friday, we've got a sleep debt of about 10 hours or more of missing sleep. Okay, so I'm just going to briefly talk about what the causes are of sleep deprivation. You might have a sense already. You might have some things in mind, like iPhones and different things like that. But this is really what we describe in the book. What we came to understand is that there is really a perfect storm of factors going on here that create difficulty for kids getting enough sleep. So it's important to look at all the reasons so that we can then start to make changes in each of those areas to get them the sleep they need. So the first thing to know about what makes sleep difficult for teens is that their brain clocks are different than ours. So essentially in adolescence, which I said, is around 12 to 25, the clock in the brain that controls a lot of things, but including sleep, the clock in the brain is set about 2 hours later than it is for young kids and for adults. So that means that legitimately at a chemical level, at a neurological level, teenagers are tired about 2 hours later than us and want to wake up about 2 hours later than us. Their melatonin rises later. They also want to sleep later in the morning. It's a natural delay in the sleep clock. It's not just a preference. It's not like just that they like to stay up late or they are trying to be rebellious or have independent time. Their chemistry is set differently than ours. And so that's the first thing that makes it challenging. The next thing is that they have quite a lot of homework, and especially as they get towards the middle and end of high school. So, this obviously, we could talk a lot about homework, and I'm sure you have and will have discussions about the ideal amount of homework, but really having homework, and especially if they're taking AP classes or getting towards, applying for college, this can really take a huge chunk out of their day, of course. And then we've got all the activities that they're involved in, busy kids doing lots of things. I put technology and social media in big font because it is a huge sleep stealer. It really is. It is hard to turn off social media. There are a couple of different reasons. One we hear about is the blue light. Yes, it does activate the brain, but even more than that is the fact that technology and algorithms are brilliant, right? They're brilliant and they keep us engaged. And the teenage brain is even more socially wired than adult brains. So it is so hard to put down something that keeps you engaged with your friends, that, the socially wired brain of the teenager is extremely activated by social media, by YouTube, by all the things. So turning off technology is really difficult, and it tends to create a state of flow as well. And that state of flow is something we usually hear about in a positive way, like when you're working and you love what you're doing, you create a state of flow. But technology also creates a state of flow. It's that feeling that we have of like, where did my time, what happened? I just looked at my phone and now all of a sudden it's 45 minutes later. I don't even know what happened. So a state of flow can take over. And for teenagers, it's really hard to disengage and let the mind calm down. And that's just part of it, is that social media technology. With the advent of the smartphone, you see that sleep time just took a further nosedive in the data when you look at how much teenagers sleep. So that is definitely a big factor. And on the other end of the day, we have early start times, which now in California, yay, we can't start high school before 8:30. That's great. But you can see how sleep is essentially chipped away at from both sides. And what a teenager would like to sleep versus how they are sleeping is really compromised. And this is where we get, this optimal amount of sleep being 9 hours and the reality being more like 6.5. Okay. And now what's the big deal about this? Does this really affect our kids? I think one of the reasons that we don't necessarily appreciate why this is so important is that we think of sleep as being rest. So if you rest, you lie down in your bed, you close your eyes, you fall asleep, you're just resting. So if you rest for 6 hours or you rest for 9 hours, what's the big deal? But actually, sleep is really not rest at all. When you fall asleep, there are many regions of your brain that become more active than when you were awake. And we just don't experience sleep, so we don't think about all the things that are happening. We're not conscious, but it's amazing to look at what's going on in the brain while you sleep. And we could talk about that forever, but I just want to highlight a couple of things that are going on because they really relate so much to high schoolers. They're really especially important to high schoolers. The first thing is this region of the brain called the hippocampus. It's where information comes into the brain as short-term memories, but needs to be converted into long-term memories. So important for what you're learning at school. You're learning algebra equations, you're memorizing, dates for history. All the information that you're learning during the day has to be converted into long-term memories. And that happens in a region of the brain called the hippocampus, but it happens while you sleep. And if you don't sleep enough, then basically your hippocampus really is not as active. So it really impacts how much you can learn, how much you remember later, but it also, when you're not sleeping enough, I mean, we all know the feeling of not sleeping enough and not being able to focus or feel inspired. So that's definitely something that is, that image that we have of a kid asleep on his desk, not feeling inspired or just feeling so tired. It's so obvious, right, that learning is really impacted when you don't sleep enough. The other thing that's happening while you sleep is you're dreaming. And the reason I bring this up for teenagers is that dream sleep is, dreams are kind of mysterious, right? We don't necessarily know exactly why we dream, but it turns out that one of the reasons we dream is to process our thoughts and feelings and emotions that have happened in our life. So in our dreams, our life kind of plays back in this bizarre way. And it really is clear from the research that dream sleep is particularly important to mental health, because dream sleep is part of the way we process our days. And if you have like a really intense feeling during that dream sleep, your brain is basically soothed, and that feeling can become less intense, and it sort of helps you make sense of your emotions, make sense of your day. Dream sleep happens mostly in the morning. So for teenagers, dream sleep is happening for basically the last 3 hours of the night. And this means that if they have to wake up for school extremely early, they're missing out on really important dream sleep. So that's just something to think about and to know. Dream sleep is very important. It doesn't really happen much in the beginning of the night. It's really an early morning activity. And one of the reasons that the later start time was so important, to shift kids, to get them even just 30 minutes more sleep in the morning, gets them 30 minutes more dream time, which is actually really important for their mental health. And then this is one of the coolest things I think I've seen in recent years. This is kind of a new discovery, but basically scientists figured out that while you're sleeping, your brain is being cleaned. So this is like a fluid being flushed through the brain at regular intervals during deep sleep. And so while you're awake, your brain is producing all this activity. It's going through all this activity. It's producing waste products and toxins, but it has this really efficient way of cleaning itself by flushing fluid through and washing those toxins away. But that does not happen until you fall asleep. So it's like kind of like a washing machine that's going on in your brain only while you sleep. And for me, this is one of the most, like this really hits home with me, because when I'm sleep deprived, I do feel like my brain is cluttered and foggy. This is what it feels like. So this brain cleaning is super important, obviously, and one of the reasons that protecting sleep is so important. And I promise I'm about to get to what we can do about all this in just a minute. But so just from thinking about all the things that are going on in the brain while our teenagers are asleep, it's pretty clear what the consequences are going to be of losing sleep. So one of the things that happens is that memory is impacted, learning is impacted. It's really hard to take in information in a meaningful way. Maybe you spit it out for a test the next morning, but come the next semester, you're probably not going to remember it as well if you're learning it on a sleep deprived brain. So learning is obviously really impacted. And I think, a lot of kids have said to me, I thought I wasn't interested in a certain class. I thought it was boring. And when they start getting more sleep, sure enough, that class actually becomes more interesting to them. And so I think that's really important to think about, is the inspiration that kids have, the creative juices that they have in class are really, highly impacted by how much they sleep. There are a lot of studies showing that the optimal time for really creative learning is in the mid-morning. So around 10 a.m., something around there, is where the teen brain is extremely focused and ready to learn. And this is why we like the later start time, and why we don't necessarily want to make, a calculus exam happen, at 7:50 in the morning. The teen brain, like I said, is shifted later. So, and then the prefrontal cortex, which is our wise brain, with, the part of our brain that soothes us and makes sense of the world, is less active when we don't sleep enough. The amygdala, which most of us know, is that region of the brain that's kind of your fight or flight area, that can make things seem more negative or more fear-based or anger. The amygdala is actually up to 60% more active when you're sleep deprived. So not a surprise that, kids who are sleep deprived are more likely to have mental health issues. Sleeping less than 8 hours a night does raise the risk of depression, but sleeping 6 hours or less can up to triple the risk of depression. And given what we just went over in terms of what goes on in the brain, it makes perfect sense. So I think that, right now we know that more than 1 in 3 high schoolers is reporting that they've had a persistent feeling of sadness or hopelessness. And at the same time, sleep has been shrinking and shrinking. And so those two things are not unrelated. These two trends are absolutely connected to each other. And it's that's our mission, is to add back some sleep for kids, because we truly believe that if we could get kids more sleep, we could go a long way towards turning the tide on that mental health crisis, or at least getting them to the place where we can help figure out what's really going on. So I think that mental health, and I am the parent of a teenager, so I personally think that this is the number one reason that we want to get our kids more sleep, and that we want to make sleep a priority, is because we want to improve their mental health. So let's see. So I just touched on mental health, and I touched on learning, which I think are the two important things that we really think about in high school. Like, how can we set our kids up for optimal learning and inspiration and long-term success as a student? And how can we help them feel more positive and more optimistic? But I haven't even touched on all the things that happen physically in the body when we don't sleep enough. And I'm not going to go into that, because there are a lot more things that relate to physical health that, decline with poor sleep and improve with good sleep. Okay. And I love LeBron James. I love LeBron James, but I love his quote about sleep. He's like an ambassador of sleep. And LeBron James is now in his 19th season in the NBA, I think. And he is a huge proponent of sleep. He sleeps like 9 to 10 hours a night. And he attributes a lot of his success to the fact that he gets such good sleep. And I really think that that's the reason that he can play for 19 seasons in the NBA, is that he takes his sleep so seriously. So he is at a way reduced risk of injury. And when he does get injured, he recovers a lot more quickly because of that sleep, because of those good sleep habits. One more thing about sports, because I'm sure that we've got some sports families in the mix here. The Stanford researchers who run one of the main labs at one of the main sleep labs is at Stanford. So that Stanford Sleep Lab uses the Stanford sports teams kind of like guinea pigs to figure out what happens when they manipulate their sleep and what happens to their performance. And they've done, different studies on different teams, but one of them is with the swim team. They made them dedicate 10 hours to sleeping. I'm not saying that your teenagers have to sleep for 10 hours. We're just, talking optimal conditions here. They had them dedicate 10 hours to sleep. And sure enough, their lap times got faster, their time off the block. So the time it took them to react and actually get in the water went down. And so you see all these performance in, basically you see sports performance is optimized when kids are sleeping well. And high school athletes, when you look at all the risk factors for injury, so how many hours they train, how many sports they do, what is their workout routine, how much do they sleep? The number one predictor for high school athletes of being injured is how much they sleep. It's not those other things. It's how much they sleep. So sleep is so important for athletes. And it's one of the reasons I like to talk to sports coaches as well, because we want to use sleep as part of our sports training. We don't want to put, sports and sleep at odds, which is often what happens. We actually want to harness the power of sleep to help our athletes get better at what they do. And all right. I'm going to talk about what we can do to help our kids sleep, since I think if we're all feeling like, yes, we know it's important, but what do we do about it? So because going back to that timeline that I gave you of what shrinks and why, we can see that sleep getting better for teenagers is not just about saying, oh, get more sleep, go to bed early. Sleep is like a community effort, because not like when they were babies and we had so much control over their sleep. Now their sleep is impacted by all these other factors. We really have to look at this as a community effort. And so we need to look at what schools are doing, what coaches are doing. And now we know that the early start time has been at least a little bit alleviated. So that's great. But overall, here's the good news, is that sleep is really natural. Sleep is what the body is programmed to do. And most of what helps teenagers sleep well is going back to what is happening in nature. So we call this paleo sleep. It's just a way of thinking about how to improve our sleep by connecting with what's going on in the world. Basically, humans evolved obviously without smartphones, without artificial light. And to improve sleep, we really want to take our cues from light and dark. And I'm going to be really specific and practical about this, because there's some things I think you can start doing, and talking to your teenager about and doing for yourself right away that can really improve your sleep. And most of it has to do with thinking about darkness and light, because the brain clock really only responds to darkness and light. It doesn't know about all this other stuff that we do in our day. It is simply responding to a 24-hour, it's a 24-hour clock that's responding to light and darkness. So let me just back up for a second and talk about what I think is an important practice for schools. I'm just going to talk about this quickly, because mostly we're talking about what we can do as parents. But I have to say that schools have a big role in this. So of course, start times later, that's great. If there's any way to start with outside time, again, the brain clock responds to light. And if kids start their day by going, from their house into a car right into school, and they don't see much sunlight, it really impacts when they're able to fall asleep at night. So if your teenager is saying, yeah, of course I want to, get good sleep, but I can't fall asleep. I just lie there. I'm not tired. I'm not tired. Part of the reason that that's happening is because their brain clocks are just not adjusted. So the brain clock is not producing melatonin at the right time. And the things that help with that are getting sunlight in the morning. So I recommend that teens try to get at least 5 minutes of sun. Thankfully, we're in a region that the sun is really strong. So if they get outside and experience sun for 5 minutes every morning when they first wake up, it presses go on their internal clock. It starts a timer. Amazingly, it starts a timer that lets the brain know, again, we're going back to paleo sleep. It's as if you're out in nature. The brain clock is like, oh, okay, it's morning, I get it. Let me start planning for the night, because your brain clock is always tracking on a 24-hour schedule. So when you wake up in the morning and see sunlight, it has a lot to do with when you fall asleep at night. And I'll talk about what this means for teenagers, but I say that just because schools can have a role here. If there's any way to get kids moving outside first thing in the day, first period, second period, even just getting a little outside time before they go into the classroom for first period. If they get 5 minutes, 10 minutes of sun, it will help them sleep better at night. Okay, so a couple of these things are things that I was saying about, like, the teenage brain doesn't really think that clearly and isn't that inspired at 7:50. So scheduling more, academic classes and tests that are not right first thing in the morning, but going with the natural brain clock, and giving a little more lead up time to those really challenging classes is great. Another thing I really love seeing, my son is a freshman in high school, and his biology class had 2 full lectures. I couldn't believe it, on sleep. And I love that, of course. So I think teaching sleep, this is what we're doing at your high school, so that's wonderful. Making it part of the curriculum, that we teach would be wonderful. Working with sunlight, so leaving the windows open and shades in the morning. And there's a bunch of other things here for class, for schools. I'd love for schools to have a nap room. We call it a Z's room, where kids can sign up to safely take a nap for 30 minutes or so during the day if they need to. If they are not able to get enough sleep at night, we'd rather they sleep during the day than come home from practice at 5 o'clock and crash, or have a late afternoon nap, because that really impacts their night. And so what families can do. So like I said, sleep is a community effort. We do need to look at all these other factors that are impacting sleep, but what are the things that you can do tonight or this weekend, or when what are the things that you actually have immediate control over? In our book, in Generation Sleepless, we have what we call the 5 habits of happy sleepers. I'm not going to go over all of them, but they are: set your sleep times and layout. We have 3 routines that really help protect your sleep: extract your sleep stealers, eliminate light, and practice a sleep-friendly daytime. So I'm not going to go into all of them, but I am going to give you some real takeaways from a couple of these habits. And the kids are going to learn these too. These habits create what we call the sleep bubble. And the concept of the sleep bubble is basically like we think of sleep as starting when we get into bed, but it doesn't. It doesn't start when we get into bed. It starts earlier in the day. It's, you're leading up to sleep for at least 2 hours before you get in bed. So what you do in those 2 hours really makes a big difference. And so we like to create this nice protective bubble around sleep, and not just say, all right, get into bed and try to fall asleep, because that's not going to happen. If you're a teenager, that's not going to happen. So setting your sleep times is a really big part of this, because the brain likes regularity, and the brain clock is tracking what we're doing at all times. So what we like to tell teenagers is, actually, everyone talks about bedtime, but I like to take the pressure off of bedtime, because it it can be not so effective to just try to tell kids to go to bed early because, like I said, they're not naturally tired sometimes. What I tell teenagers to do is actually focus on their wake up time, because it's easier to force yourself to get up, right? You cannot force yourself to fall asleep. You just can't. If your body is not ready for sleep, you cannot force yourself to sleep. But painful as it might be, you actually can force yourself to get out of bed. So, and like I said, when you wake up and see the sun, it lets your brain know that it's daytime and it starts that clock. So focusing on wake up time is much easier. And when we do this with teens, what we want to tell them is to add that 5 minutes at least of sun in the morning when they first get up. And then on the weekends, this is the hard part, the brain really gets confused and goes into what we call a social jet lag if we sleep in a ton on a Saturday morning or on a Sunday morning. And so, so a lot of teens will say to me, I just try to go to bed early on, Sunday night. I try to get a jump on the week and I try to go to bed early and I just can't. And then I say, what time do you wake up on Sunday morning or Saturday morning? And they've slept, way past when they would have slept during the week. So we try to get teens to wake up. 1 hour is ideal, but that's really hard if you've got, a very early wake up time for school. So 2 hours is also fine. I sometimes tell teens to do 2 hours on Saturday and 1 on Sunday. That's ideal because then we're getting the brain ready for the next day. And we don't want to go into a state of social jet lag. It makes things a lot harder. And the other thing about timing is that if you can take a nap early in the day, napping is kind of not ideal. I'd rather that teens get 8 hours of sleep at night, but a busy teen who's got a lot going on and just absolutely cannot get 8 hours of sleep and does need to nap, it's better that it happens earlier in the day than like I said, coming home, getting done with all they have to do and then crashing. And the other thing that really impacts their sleep is if they're drinking caffeine, do they have any caffeine in the afternoon? The half-life of caffeine is 6 hours. So having, a Coke or any other caffeinated drink past 2 o'clock in the afternoon is probably going to affect what time they can fall asleep. So these are rough schedules. These are actually from our book, kind of ideal schedules for middle and high schoolers. And middle and high schoolers need the same amount of sleep. High schoolers do not need less sleep than middle schoolers, but nothing in life is optimal. We just have to work with what we have and try to work towards what we know is best. So I try to help high schoolers, especially in the later part of high school, get 8 hours of sleep, and middle schoolers to get 9 hours of sleep. You've probably all heard of wind down time. So we actually like teens to have 3 routines and grownups too. Wind down time, like I said, sleep doesn't start when you get into bed. It starts about 1 or 2 hours before you get into bed. And that 1 or 2 hours, let's just call it 1 hour because that's more realistic. That 1 hour before you go to bed, there are 2 things that have to go on during wind down time in order for teens to feel ready to sleep. One is that the light needs to be reduced. So having, just turning down the lights in the house makes a big difference. Not looking at a screen that's really close up, but also not having anything stressful happen. And stressful or really engaging. So we have these are just examples of wind down do's and don'ts. So what watching a movie on the television is fine because that's at a distance and that's fine. We're not, but working on your laptop in bed is much more engaging. During wind down time, yes, do read a book that you really like. Do not, watch YouTube videos. Yes, walk the dog. Don't start an exciting project. Yes, talk about the funny things the dog did that day. No, don't talk about an emotionally charged decision to quit the basketball team. Yes, talk about what you did in robotics class. No, don't start researching how to save for college. We have to disengage the mind during wind down time. That's super important. Otherwise, like I said, sleep is natural, but we have to get out of our own way in order to sleep. So that wind down time is really helpful. It's absolutely essential for teens because they have a harder time disconnecting and they have a harder time falling asleep. So creating that wind down time, it's the 1 hour before. My husband said, "Why do you have to make fun of Space Odyssey?" And I didn't mean to make fun of a Space Odyssey, but you get what I'm saying. Watching the Space Odyssey versus watching The Conjuring. Okay, so that's the wind down time. Then we've got your bedtime routine, which is different. That's just those simple steps. Everyone knows what a bedtime routine is, but we kind of think of bedtime routines as being for little kids, and they're not. Everyone needs a bedtime routine. So teens should come up with their own, depends on how old they are, but if they come up with something that, again, this is within wind down time, so we don't want to be FaceTiming with friends during this time. We do want to be, reading a book in bed or having a last chat or writing in a journal. Taking a shower is a really good thing to do. And if anyone has questions about like listening to an audiobook or a podcast, I can talk about that. And then the morning routine, which you already know I'm going to say is really mostly about getting outside. Get outside, get the sun. It's so important. And that's really the most important thing about the morning routine. Okay, and the last thing I want to just talk about is, teenagers need us. Teenagers need to feel self-motivated, right? So we can care about sleep as much as we want and learn about sleep, but if our teens don't feel inspired or connected themselves to this, then it's not going to work. So, this is hard. This is a tricky part about changing sleep habits, is that we don't have a whole lot of control over a lot of things. And that's just what it's supposed to be, right? That's normal, that's natural. So once you've crossed over into that zone where now your teen is really in charge of these things, the tactic really has to be more about tapping into their motivation and what they care about. So you really, I'm sure you're all really good listeners, and just keep on doing it. And being a really active listener means, saying things like, "I hear you, tell me more. That sounds hard." Not jumping in with our advice or, trying to say to teens, you need to get more sleep. You're sleep deprived. It's so important and you need to go to bed. Instead, I want you to try to look for an opportunity to talk about sleep based on something they care about. So that means you're looking for an in. All roads lead to sleep. It's really true. So whatever your teenager is caring about, talking about, this math homework is really hard. I keep getting injured. What's going on? Look for an in and follow their thread of interest instead of trying to, just give them direct advice. And you can ask open-ended questions. So instead of saying something like, "Clearly you're not getting enough sleep," you might want to say, "How do you feel about your sleep?" Instead of saying, don't you think you need to go to bed earlier?" You might say, "What are your thoughts on when you go to bed and when you wake up?" And observing instead of judging. So instead of saying, "You're tired, I can tell, go to bed," you might want to say, "I saw you nodding off while we were watching a movie." And, so practicing that reflective listening, and really being non-judgmental and being curious and on their side is so important. And so, I find that no teenager likes to be told what to do, but all teenagers like to feel good and happy and healthy. So, I think that's really the point. So, that is that. And I'm happy to take questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We If anybody has questions, I do have one or two, please just put them in the chat to me, questions, Kristen. I am also going to put a few things in the chat that I would love for you all to have. The first one is we have a quick parent survey that we'd love for you to do. It's super quick. You can do it now or just bring it up on your computer and do it later. It's about your children's sleep and how much they're getting. Add a spotlight so both of us are on there. So please do that. I'm also going to, as we're doing questions, add in a few things on Heather's website so you can look for more information. A link to buy her book. We will also have it at back to school night on Thursday. If you come find the challenge success table, we will have a copy of it. She's going to give me a nice clean one so you don't have to read all my notes. So thank you. And then we're going to also, there's a PDF that Heather gave us that is called the Sleep Challenge. So we are going to put that in there as well. We're trying to keep this to 7:30. We started a couple minutes late. So, you know, we're going to do like 5 or 6 questions and then we're probably going to need to stop this, but you can definitely get in touch with us and we can try and answer your questions aside from this as well. So the first question I got was, as you were talking about sports, one parent said, my daughter has practice with her swim team at 5:15 a.m. twice a week. Is that a healthy practice?
It's a great question. It's not an ideal practice because of how much they're missing in terms of their dream sleep, and that those morning hours really are so important. So I think swimming is one of the hardest, and rowing, you know, those sports that are early in the morning can be really hard. I think that it's kind of a balancing act because of course, you know, swimmers, kids want to be active and in sports, and it's really, you know, it means a lot to them. So I would definitely talk to the coach. I like to talk to coaches for this reason, to see if there are adjustments, even adjusting practice times by half an hour. In fact, even just having the goal of getting 30 minutes more sleep a night can make a really big difference over time. That's, you know, a half an hour a night means what, 2.5 hours at the end of the week. That's wonderful. So even moving practice a little bit. And I would say that if 5:30 in the morning is a practice time, then it's really kind of the best. I'm actually guessing that when this swimmer wakes up at 5:30 in the morning, they're really tired for bed unless they take a nap later in the day. So maybe they're actually getting decent sleep because they really truly feel tired. They've gotten up, they've seen that early morning sun, it pressed go on their brain clock, and they actually get to bed a lot earlier than other kids. So, you know, I think it's just, and if it's not that different, what we don't want to do is get to the weekend and then say, okay, I'm going to sleep until 11 a.m. because that really causes a lot of confusion in the brain. So no, it's not ideal, but yes, athletes do have to, you know, deal with extreme training schedules. So it's a really tricky one.
So kind of a follow-up to that, somebody said, well, if your student is an early morning riser, are those practices bad for them if they really enjoy it, if they get up early anyway?
So some kids are, just like adults we all have different preferences for what time. Some of us are morning people, some of us are evening people. Some teenagers do just prefer the morning. They don't go through this shift that we described. So is the question that if you have a morning person, is it okay to wake up early?
Is it okay to go to 5:15 practices? I know I have some friends whose kids wake up at 5:30. Like one of my best friends, her son every day for their whole life has woken up at 5:30. So I assume that might be okay for him because he's probably going to bed earlier. But yeah,
that's the thing, is that if you can really adjust your brain clock and then you don't go far off of that on the weekend, that's better. But I mean, sports are so important, have so much value. I think it is something to think about and to bring up with coaches. But at the end of the day, you know, when kids love sports, that's really important too. So I think I would just say that when they are waking up that early, to really try to protect a decently early bedtime, which should be okay, given that they probably are really tired.
Sounds good. Just so everybody knows, the PDF, apparently I checked the permissions on the wrong email to check them on today. So I'm going to work on the permissions on the PDF. Sorry, it's not working right now, but as Heather's answering this next one, I'll keep working on it. Okay. Can you talk about sleep audio apps, podcasts geared towards sleeping, and if studies show them to be effective or harmful?
So if teens have a hard time disconnecting and they do need we call them passive distractions. So yes, it can be really helpful. The key is that it needs to be interesting enough to pull your mind away from your internal chatter, has to be engaging enough and interesting enough, but not so interesting and engaging or activating that you just need to keep going. So listening to a podcast, if a teen is really, I really like to have teens work on all the 5 habits. And then if they can't, they still find that they can't fall asleep, like they've gotten that 5 minutes of sunlight, and they haven't slept in too much on the weekends, all that stuff, and they still can't fall asleep. Then we say, okay, let's add a passive distraction. And that means something like an audiobook or a podcast that is, relatively easygoing, but interesting enough that everybody has to find what that is for themselves, because what's really interesting and activating to somebody else could be super boring to some, so it needs to be interesting enough to quiet your mind and distract you, but not so engaging that it's like that Netflix binging thing where you're like, I got to know what happens next. I got to keep listening to the next episode. So I think that it has its place for sure.
Great. So there is a student that's watching with their parent, and I'm going to try and summarize this a little bit. They basically there's so much going on. We're sleep deprived because we have so much homework. We have to balance it with maintaining friendships and extracurriculars and the pressure to apply to college and figure out who we are. How do you help them calm that? I mean, it's the world around them.
Yeah.
Is there something that you would say to a teen that's got all those worries?
Well, I would say that high school is the most challenging time to get good sleep. It really is. I've done talks at universities, and those kids oftentimes will talk about their struggles with sleep, but they'll say, you know what, the most sleep deprived I've ever been is my junior and senior year in high school. And that's because of all these factors that you just mentioned. It's absolutely true. And so I do kind of phrase that to high schoolers by saying that this is a time of life when you might feel very overscheduled and that you don't have a lot of flexibility, and you don't feel necessarily like you're making as many choices. But it is a moment in time. When you go to college, you have a lot more flexibility in how you schedule your classes and what classes you take. The dynamic will shift a lot. So I think just knowing that this is this period of life. And of course, we want to try to increase the choices that kids have. I definitely am a big proponent of lowering homework, because more or less the research kind of shows that 1 hour of homework adds positive benefit. After an hour of homework really only adds stress and decreases sleep. So I do think that homework is a big issue. The average high schooler in California has something like 3 to 4 hours a night of homework, or 3 hours. It's too much, and it really makes it difficult to protect sleep. So, I think that's something this is why I think sleep really is a community effort, and not just we never wrote Generation Sleepless to point the finger at parents and teens and say, you need to prioritize your sleep, you need to get better sleep, because all these other entities in their life that need to take responsibility. This is really not just something that teenagers can solve right away on their own. Of course, there are things they can do to add back in as much sleep as possible, but we really do put a lot of responsibility on coaches and teachers and all of that.
It kind of goes with this. And again, you don't want to blame one area, but there's quite a few questions kind of saying, as parents, what can we do? And it was really interesting because when we were talking about the assemblies tomorrow, we're having some of the students introduce you, and and then say thank you to you at the end. And we talked about, what can parents do? What can students do? What can the school do? And that's part of what the survey is that you have and the one that we're giving the students tomorrow. And one of the kids said to me, well, what can parents do? And I was like, I'll tell you a couple things I do. And that's, I model good sleep behavior. When I'm tired, I go to bed. I can't win the battle of keeping all phones out of our bedrooms in my household. But we, talk about why they shouldn't be on, or for the younger kids, I definitely still can rule that. Now, my senior, I've got no control over. My 13-year-old, I still got control over. So I still have control over. Do you have any other suggestions of how things parents can do without seeming like an ogre to help students?
Yeah, I think you mentioned the two most important, which are modeling good sleep habits. So looking at your own behavior with technology, talking about sleep as a family priority. So this is not just about teens, but just modeling how important your own sleep is and talking about your own sleep instead of, pointing the finger at teens. Modeling healthy sleep and good, balance around that is really important. And then when, middle school, what I notice is that by the end of middle school, a lot of good, healthy sleep habits have gone out the window. So having a bedtime and having a routine and not having technology in the bedroom are things that I recommend in middle school that parents really hold on to, because it gets harder and harder if you let go of those things. It's harder to get them back. So even in the beginning of high school, I still recommend that you come up with a bedtime with your teen. So just the fact of having a bedtime is protective. A lot of teenagers don't even feel like they know what their bedtime is. They just basically go, 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 go. And when everything's done, they finally sleep. So having an actual bedtime is really important. And not having your phone in the bedroom. I know it's like sometimes feels like that's impossible, but it is absolutely protective to your sleep. So if you have a 9th grader, a 10th grader, having a place that everybody charges their phone overnight is super, super important and helpful for you too as parents. So use a regular alarm clock and do that. By the end of high school, you don't want to control that because they're going to go to college. We want to hand over control gradually and use more of that self-motivation to inspire them. So more of those tools that I talked about to getting to things they care about. So the approach kind of shifts with younger high schoolers. I would say you absolutely can. And I recommend having bedtimes, having no technology in the bedroom. By the end of high school, now you're using that self-motivation talk because we don't have that same control.
Thank you so much. Because it is 7:35, there are, a few other questions, but it's late. I'm going to let us go. If you have more questions, I'm going to put an email address for me in the chat. You're welcome to email me. I will get your questions to Heather, and I know she's happy to help us out a little bit more, which would be awesome. Just to reiterate this, the book I'm bringing to the back to school night is just a copy. If you want to buy it, I put the Amazon link in the chat. So I'm just going to bring a copy so you can peruse it while you're at back to school night. But if you actually want to buy a copy, please go on Amazon or your favorite bookseller, independent bookseller. Go to Vroman's. Vroman's is where I think I bought mine, actually. I bought it at Vroman's, so independent bookseller. When we were at a Challenge Success conference, it was at a little independent bookseller in Boston too. That was very fun. So I'm just going to get my email, which is a Challenge Success email. So it just goes to the Challenge Success group. I'll put that in the chat right now. And there you have it. I want to thank you all so much for being here. Really appreciate you being here, Heather. It's been so enlightening and wonderful to read your book and hear you then talk about it. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It was great to be with you.